Hello everyone and welcome back to the Dungeon Learner's Guide. This week we've got another Commander's Guild deck tech. This is deck 191 and it's titled Mighty Morphin. And if you haven't seen this show before, what we're doing is randomly selecting a card from scryfall.com or from among suggested cards, working with a budget of $100 or less and building a commander deck for Magic the Gathering around a theme of the chosen card. So this week, our random card is going to be Vannifar Evolved Enigma, which is 2 green-blue for a 3/4 legendary creature Elf Ooze Wizard. At the beginning of combat on your turn, choose one. You can either cloak a card from your hand, which is putting it face down as a 2/2 creature with Ward 2, or you can put a +1/+1 counter on each colorless creature you control. So obviously, if we are playing Vannifar as our random card of the week, then it only makes sense that she is also our commander, since she is a legendary creature. And since we have Vannifar in the command zone, we can kind of build around both of her abilities, and I'll explain that a little bit more once we get into some of our themes for this deck. And that's mainly because the very first theme is the biggest thing that we want to be building around, and that is face down creatures. Recently, there has been a lot of support for face-down creatures in Magic. There's Morph, there's Megamorph, there's Manifest, Manifest Dread, there's also the Cloak and Disguise mechanics. So there are a ton of ways for us to get creatures into play that are face-down. And a good example of why we would want our creatures face down is cards like Nantuko Vigilante, which is 3 and a green for a 3/2 Insect Druid Mutant. It has Morph for 1 and a green, so we can, again, play it face down for 3 mana as a 2/2 creature, flip it face up for 2, and when it's turned face up, destroy target artifact or enchantment. So a lot of our removal, a lot of our card draw, a lot of our efficient value spells are going to be based around creatures that have those turning face up abilities, because not only can Vannifar put them into play, she's also able to put +1/+1 counters on them, because while they are face down, they do count as colorless creatures. And with that in mind, we're going to move to theme number 2, which is going to be turning the creatures face up. We have a lot of creatures that want to turn face up and trigger abilities on their own, but we also have cards like Secret Plans that actively reward us for turning those creatures face up. And what Secret Plans is going to do is it's green and a blue for an enchantment. Face down creatures get +0/+1, and whenever a permanent you control is turned face up, draw a card. So now, not only are we advancing our game plan by just casting our creatures and turning them face up for value, we're also now drawing cards with Secret Plans. So as long as we just continue to play our game, do what we were really planning to do anyway, we can get even more additional value. And then finally, we come to our last theme of the deck that I've kind of already hinted at, and that one is going to be colorless spells. The unique interaction between a lot of cards really comes into play when we highlight the fact that Morphs, Manifests, and everything else are colorless creatures, because that means cards like Mystic Forge actually become huge value engines. Because Mystic Forge is 4 mana for an artifact, you may look at the top card of your library at any time, you may cast artifact spells and colorless spells from the top of your library, and you can tap it to pay 1 life and exile the top card of your library. So this is a very unique interaction with Morph, because it won't allow us to cast Nantuko Vigilante, for example, off the top of our library, because it's not a colorless spell. We can actually cast it as a morph off the top of our library, because then the game recognizes it as a colorless spell, meaning that we are capable of casting pretty much any of our morphs or manifests or anything like that from the top of our deck. And now we're getting additional value because it's like drawing a card. It's just putting the top card of our deck into play. It's probably triggering some other effects we have. It's putting a creature into play that our opponents have no idea what it is. And then we can eventually flip it face up and get even more value from things like Secret Plans. So ideally, all of our synergies in this deck really focus around the face down creatures, and particularly the fact that they are colorless, in a way that's going to benefit us and push us so far ahead in value that it's going to be very difficult for our opponents to keep up. With that in mind, though, we are going to move on from our themes and start to take a look at some of our key cards. These are the cards that really synergize with what we're trying to do, and in some cases are value pieces or win conditions all on their own. So the very first of our key cards that I want to highlight is going to be Hauntwood's Shrieker. And Hauntwood's Shrieker, a very new card coming out of Duskmourn. It is 1 green for a 3/3 beast mutant. Whenever it attacks, you manifest Dread. So you look at the top 2 cards of your library, put one onto the battlefield face down as a 2/2 creature, and the other into your graveyard. Then at any time, you can pay 1 and a green and reveal target face down permanent, and if it's a creature card, you may turn it face up. This is incredibly powerful in this deck for a couple of different reasons. Number one, this is going to be letting us manifest Dread every single time it attacks, which is giving us just a free 2/2 creature that most likely will be able to do something and flip face up. But it also lets us skip on a lot of the face up costs, because now the creatures that turn up for 5 or 6 mana can be turned face up for just 2 mana with Hauntwood Shrieker, giving us a much more efficient way to get value out of our creatures, and a much quicker way to present a lethal board to our opponents, which is more than just our 2/2 colorless creatures. Moving on, though, to our next key card. For this one, I want to highlight Ugin's Mastery. And this initially doesn't look like a face-down kind of card. It really looks like an Eldrazi card, or maybe an artifact creature card. But again, because our morphs are colorless creatures, this does a lot for what we're trying to do. And this is 4 mana for an enchantment. Whenever you cast a colorless creature spell, manifest the top card of your library, and whenever you attack with creatures with total power 6 or greater, you may turn a face-down creature you control face up. So again, like Hauntwood Shrieker, there's a couple of different reasons I wanted to highlight this card. Number one is kind of the obvious. Whenever we cast a colorless creature, so a morph, manifest, whatever, we get to manifest the top card of our library. That's essentially giving us 2 creatures for the price of 1, which is very powerful in the course of the game. But it's also letting us flip our creatures face up whenever we attack with creatures with total power 6 or greater. That is just 3 manifest tokens, or if we have Vannifar and maybe are putting +1/+1 counters on our things, that's just 2 tokens. So at that point, we are able to turn pretty much anything we want face up, and the very unique wording on Ugin's Mastery means we can turn up even a non-creature face-down card, because it specifically says you may turn a face-down creature you control face up. The creatures are face down when they're in play and turn face up, meaning that we can put into play pretty much any permanent. Obviously, if it's an instant or sorcery, turning it face up does nothing. We would literally just reveal the card and then be forced to turn it back face down. But if it's an enchantment, if it's a planeswalker, well, maybe not necessarily a planeswalker, because it will lose loyalty abilities and then it just dies immediately, so maybe don't do that. But anything else, artifact, enchantment, land, that is something that can be turned face up with Ugin's Mastery, and then you get to have whatever it is. So that is why I think it's probably one of the best cards in the deck. But before I talk about it too much, let's move on to our next key card, which is going to be Panoptic Projector. And Panoptic Projector is 4 mana for an artifact. You can tap it. The next face-down creature spell you cast this turn costs 3 less to cast, meaning it is just free. And if turning a face-down permanent face up causes a triggered ability of a permanent you control to trigger, that ability triggers an additional time. Almost all of our morph creatures care about turning face up because they're going to trigger an ability, which is going to be doubled by Panoptic Projector. Being able to, say, destroy multiple artifacts, multiple enchantments, even being able to counter multiple spells if that's relevant, being able to just put counters on things if that's relevant. Panoptic Projector really just kicks this deck into overdrive, because we can slowly value out the rest of the table, but if we're doubling all of our abilities, we can very quickly value out the rest of the table. So I think Panoptic Projector, probably one of the better payoffs in the deck, and definitely a value piece that I think goes kind of unnoticed at tables. It doesn't seem very powerful at first glance because it's just triggering on turning things face up. But because our deck is built around that, we can do that incredibly quickly and very, very effectively. So those are all of our key cards for this week. And the next thing I want to do for this deck tech is take a look at some cool interactions. And these are cards that synergize incredibly well with each other, and in some cases are just fun cards that I like to highlight because I think they don't get enough love. The first pair of cards I want to take a look at is going to be between Zimone Mystery Unraveler and Threats Around Every Corner. So I know that there have been a lot of cards in here from recent Duskmourn and from Murders at Karlov Manor sets, but it turns out a lot of recent cards that have been printed for those sets do a very good job of caring about face-down creatures. So Zimone, for example, is 2 green and a blue for a legendary creature human wizard. She's a 3/3, and she has landfall. So whenever a land you control enters, manifest dread if this is the first time this ability has resolved this turn. Otherwise, you may turn a permanent you control face up. This is another card that, like Ugin's Mastery, kind of gets around the fact that manifests could be anything. Being able to just turn a permanent you control face up means we can turn the manifest face up even if they're enchantments, artifacts, lands, or whatever else. Again, still doesn't quite work with instants and sorceries, but still pretty effective. The key to Zimone, though, is the landfall, because we're going to combine her with Threats Around Every Corner, which is 3 and a green for an enchantment. When Threats Around Every Corner enters, manifest dread, and whenever a face-down permanent you control enters, search your library for a basic land card, put it onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle. What this allows us to do is essentially guarantee that we will get to the second part of Zimone's landfall ability every single turn. Because if we have Zimone in play, we play Threats Around Every Corner, we manifest Dread. That means that a face-down permanent has entered the battlefield. We're going to search our library for a basic land, put it into play. That's going to trigger Zimone, letting us manifest Dread and put a face-down permanent into play, which will trigger Threats Around Every Corner, letting us get a basic land, put it into play, which triggers Zimone, turning a permanent face up. So there's a lot going on here, but essentially, both of these combined let us get bare minimum 2 lands, get 2 manifest dreads, and turn a permanent face up. That is a tremendous amount of value from just 2 4-drops that can come down pretty early considering we're in the Simic colors, and can do a lot over the course of the game. And obviously they are both Duskmourn cards, so obviously there's a little bit of synergy there, but I still wanted to highlight it nonetheless, because this is just a crazy value engine. Moving on though, we get to our next cool interaction. This one is between Ugin the Ineffable and Dream Chisel. So Ugin the Ineffable, 6 mana for a legendary planeswalker Ugin, comes in with 4 loyalty, and colorless spells you cast cost 2 less to cast. Then you can +1, exile the top card of your library face down and look at it, create a 2/2 colorless spirit creature token. When that token leaves the battlefield, put the exiled card into your hand, and it can also -3 to destroy target permanent that's 1 or more colors. Ugin is one of those cards that every single ability on it is incredibly effective and incredibly important to what our deck is trying to do. Being able to make a colorless spirit when we care about colorless creatures, very powerful. Being able to essentially draw a card with the +1 ability because it's going to be removing the spirit eventually, maybe through combat, getting a card into our hand. And then it's also removal, plus the ramp ability of being able to make colorless spells cost 2 less. Ugin really does everything we want it to do. But where it's really going to shine is if we partner it up with Dream Chisel, which is 2 mana for an artifact that simply says face down creature spells you play cost 1 less to cast. So with these 2 cards combined, our colorless face down creatures will cost 3 less to cast, which is exactly how much it costs to cast a Morph and a card from Murders of Karlov Manor that is cloaked. I don't think it counts for Disguised, or maybe it does count for Disguised and not for Cloak. I might be getting those 2 mixed up. They always confuse me. But essentially, The idea here is that now our morphs are free. And if our morphs are free, we are saving up a ton of mana to use to actually flip them. We're triggering a lot more effects because we can play a lot more cards in one turn. And we're getting to a point where we are probably running over our opponents and just outvaluing them as the course of the game goes on. So while these two are very good cards on their own, even just Dream Chisel making our morphs cost 1 instead of 3, or I'm sorry, that's Ugin. Ugin makes our stuff cost 1 instead of 3. Dream Chisel makes them cost 2. Math is not my strong suit on this point, so the cost reduction, very important either way. But moving on from our cool interactions, we're going to get to the price of this deck. And this week, the total deck price came out to $60.96. And honestly, this deck could wind up being a lot cheaper because the most expensive card in the deck is Abhorrent Oculus, which takes up a massive $23.62. And if you were to cut this one card out of the deck, you are trimming 1/3 of the deck's price and dropping it to below $40. So this is a huge card for the deck, but it's also a card that if you do need to trim for budget purposes, cutting the Oculus makes this a much, much more affordable deck. However, if you are able to keep it in, I do highly recommend it because it really is a super, super powerful card. It's 2 and a blue for a 5/5 creature, Eye. As an additional cost to cast the spell, exile 6 cards from your graveyard. It has flying, and at the beginning of each opponent's upkeep, manifest Dread. So we are getting a free 2/2 colorless creature every single time it's an opponent's turn, and in a game of Commander, that is 3 opponents, meaning every single time around the table, we are getting 3 free colorless face-down creatures to trigger all of our effects, to put more power in play, and then find ways to win the game, because there's a very good chance we can just use Vannifar, put +1/+1 counters on all of them, make them huge, and just kind of run over our opponents. So I do think Abhorrent Oculus deserves a spot in the deck, but like I said, it is a massive part of our budget. So if you do need to trim the card to make the deck a little bit more affordable, that is something you can easily do. On the other hand, though, if you're looking to put a card into the deck that's a little bit outside of our normal budget range, I do have a suggestion for you there as well. And in this case, the card that I would recommend putting into the deck is Ripples of Potential, and the card I would recommend replacing it for is Exit Specialist. So Ripples of Potential is 1 and a blue for an instant that just says Proliferate, then choose any number of permanents you control that had a counter put on them this way. Those permanents phase out. We're not really a +1/+1 counter deck, but because Vannifar can put a +1/+1 counter on every colorless creature we control, this is probably one of the best ways we can protect our board from any board wipes, because at any point in the game, we're probably going to have +1/+1 counters on most of, if not all of our creatures. So Ripples of Potential can save all of them, plus it can proliferate them, and give us a way that when we untap and our stuff phases back in, we can probably just knock our opponents out and win the game right from there. So Ripples of Potential is one of the best protection spells that we can have for this deck, and it's a great way to make sure that we survive board wipes, maybe survive some combat, and do what we really want to be doing, while still holding up interaction and protection. But like I said, if you are putting in Ripples of Potential, you would have to take a card out, and I think the card to take out here is Exit Specialist, which is 1 and a blue for a 2/1 human detective. Can't be blocked by creatures with power 3 or greater, and it has Disguise for 1 and a blue. Then when it's turned face up, you return another target creature to its owner's hand. This, again, is not a bad card. Typically when I suggest replacing cards for these decks, they're never bad cards. They're just a little situational, or maybe not quite as good as the suggested upgrade. I think Exit Specialist can be very good, but it is most likely going to be 4 mana just to return a creature to its owner's hand. And while there are times when that could save us, or maybe let us save one of our own creatures, I do think that more often than not, it's not going to be as efficient as we want it to be, and it's not going to leave us in a position where we're feeling good about spending the mana to use it. It's again not a terrible card, but I do think Ripples of Potential would be a little bit better as an inclusion. With all of that being said, though, that brings us to the end of our deck tech. And before we get into the game, because of course we got to play a game with this deck and see how it works, I do want to take a second to highlight some of the ways that you can help support the channel. And of course, if that's not something that you're particularly interested in doing and going above and beyond, you can always just like the video and subscribe to the channel. That does help out quite a bit. But if you are looking to go a little bit above and beyond, you can find us over on Patreon, patreon.com/dungeonlearnersguide, or right here on YouTube as a channel member, where you get some amazing benefits such as the deck lists a week early. You get access to a Discord channel where we brew up a lot of the decks and also play the games that show up on the channel. So if you've ever wanted to be in the games, that is a great way to do it. Plus, the community on our Discord is pretty great. Everyone there is pretty sweet to talk to and hang around with. Next, you can also get things like the unedited gameplay videos. You can get a random card sent to you every single month. I've fallen behind a little bit on that because of a lot of recent moves, but for those of you who are at that level, they are coming out soon, I promise that. And then, personally, my favorite part of the Patreon and the channel members is that you have my guarantee that any card you suggest for the channel will be turned into a video eventually. It might take me a little while, but I will certainly get there. Of course, everyone is welcome to suggest cards. If you have suggestions, please put them in the comments of the video or send them to me on any of our social media accounts, and I will be doing my best to get to all of them, but I can't promise that in the same way I can for our patrons and channel members. So with that being said, I do want to shout out our current patrons and members, such as William Swiftfoot, Doodle, Eric Way, Jeff Winger, Jeffrey Boos, Salty and Sunshine, Tyler Esme, Sven Van Nimwegen, Patty Whack, Keegan Tawney, and Jakar. So to all of you, thank you all so much for all of your support. And like I said, if you would like to join that list of people, then please do check us out on Patreon or right here on YouTube. But with all of that being said, let's jump into our game, see how we're doing, see how our deck can do, and see what opponents we are going to be playing against. So this week, we are going to be joined by Jason playing Teysa, Opulent Oligarch, Cow playing Guillaume, Master Chef, and Bilal playing Magda, Brazen Outlaw. So starting off with Jason and his Teysa deck, this is, without kind of getting into the other two decks, probably the deck that I'm the most concerned about at the table. I think that we'll do very well dealing with combat and everything like that, but Jason being able to make a ton of tokens, which I know is kind of one of Jason's specialties, along with aristocrats, which is another of his specialties, means that this is a deck that I am really concerned about from the get-go. I know it can make a ton of tokens, I know it can do a ton of damage and drain people of a lot of life, so I'm not sure if we're going to be able to push through enough damage to make a meaningful impact. Plus, Teysa having Death Touch is a really big problem for us, combined with the fact that she is a 2/3, which stops a lot of our 2/2 morphs. So Teysa, I think personally the biggest threat in this game, but I do think it's something we can handle if we get the right draw. Moving on to Cow and his Guillaume deck. This is a deck that has shown up a couple of times on the channel. This is a food deck, and it's definitely a very unique take on food. It plays into more of like the value aspect and the fact that it wants to make artifact tokens. So it wants to benefit from making the tokens, sacrificing the tokens, finding a way to tap them to generate value or mana. And it's a very cool deck that plays with a ton of unique synergies. And every time they print new food cards, this deck just gets better and better. So I am definitely concerned about this deck as well, but I think that we can probably go wide enough that it might not be too big of an issue. And then finally, we have Bilal and his Magda deck. And this is, believe it or not, it's actually a combo deck. It's not designed around dwarves necessarily. It's actually designed around Dragon's Approach. And more specifically, he wants to use Magda and her ability to sacrifice 5 treasures and search his library for Thrumming Stone to put it into play so he can cast a Dragon's Approach and then ripple into the rest of the Dragon's Approaches in his library, meaning he can just burn out the table in one big swing. So this is a deck that I am a little concerned about because I don't know how many great answers we have to Thrumming Stone. I know we have a few that can deal with artifacts and enchantments, but if we don't have those in play at the time, there's really nothing we can do to stop this combo. So I'm a little concerned of when it starts to go off, but I think that if we can find an answer, then I think we'll probably be okay. So those are our opponents for this week. Let me know down in the comments who you think is going to walk out the winner. Make sure you get those predictions in. I always love hearing where people think the game's going to fall. But other than that, I hope you enjoyed the deck tech. I hope you will enjoy the game. I'm sure I certainly will. And I will talk to you all once it's done. At the start of the game, Jason goes first, followed by Cow, myself, and then Bilal. On Jason's first turn, he plays a swamp and casts Vat of Rebirth, which gets an oil counter whenever another artifact or creature dies under his control, and he can remove 4 counters to put a creature from his graveyard onto the battlefield. Cow plays a forest and casts Llanowar Elves. I play an island and cast Gudul Lurker, which is unblockable. Bilal plays a mountain. Jason plays a Scoured Barrens, gaining a life. Cow plays a Temple of Malady, scrying 1, then casts Ravenous Squirrel, which gets a +1/+1 counter whenever he sacrifices a creature or artifact. Then he attacks Bilal for 1. I play a forest and cast Dream Chisel, making my face down spells cost 1 less to cast, and I attack Jason for 1 with the Lurker. Bilal plays a mountain and casts Dwarven Blast Miner, which can be activated to destroy target non-basic land. Jason plays a Plains and casts his commander Teysa, Opulent Oligarch, investigating in his end step for each opponent who lost life this turn, and making a 1/1 spirit token once a turn whenever a clue he controls is put into the graveyard. Cow casts Tireless Tracker, investigating when a land enters under his control and putting a +1/+1 counter on it when he sacrifices a clue. Then he plays a forest, investigating, and attacks me for 1 with the squirrel. I play a Scavenger Grounds and attack Cow for 1, then in my second main phase, I cast Scroll of Fate, which can tap to let me manifest a card from my hand. Bilal casts his commander, Magda, Brazen Outlaw, which creates a treasure token whenever a dwarf he controls becomes tapped, and lets him sacrifice 5 treasures to search his library for an artifact or dragon, putting it into play. He then attacks me for 2 with the Blast Miner and makes a treasure. Jason plays a Fetid Heath and attacks Bilal for 2 with Teysa. Then in his second main phase, he casts Baron Bertram Greywater, making a 1/1 vampire rogue once per turn when 1 or more tokens enter under his control. Then he moves to his end step, investigating and making a vampire. Cow plays a Rogue's Passage, investigating, and casts Inspiring Statuary, giving his non-artifact spells Improvise. He also casts his commander Guillaume, Master Chef, making a food token in his end step for each creature that entered under his control this turn. Then he moves to his end step, making a food, and at the end of turn, I activate Scroll of Fate, manifesting a card. On my turn, I play a forest and attack Bilal for 1, then in my second main phase, I cast Ugin's Mastery, manifesting the top card of my library whenever I cast a colorless creature spell, and turning a face-down creature I control face up whenever I attack with creatures with total power 6 or greater. Bilal plays a mountain and casts 7 dwarves, which gets +1/+1 for each other copy of 7 dwarves he controls. He then attacks me for 2 and makes another treasure. Jason attacks Bilal for 3 with Baron, and attacks Cow for 2 with Teysa. Then in his second main phase, he casts Court of Ambition, becoming the Monarch and making each opponent lose 3 life unless they discard a card in his upkeep, or, if he's the Monarch, each opponent loses 6 life unless they discard 2 cards. Then he draws a card in his end step for being the Monarch, makes 2 clue tokens, and makes a vampire token. Jason also remembers that he didn't play a land, so he plays a Godless Shrine tapped. Cow sacrifices a clue, drawing a card and putting a +1/+1 counter on both the Tireless Tracker and Ravenous Squirrel, then attacks Jason for 5 with Guillaume becoming the Monarch, and in his second main phase, plays a Castle Lochthwain investigating, and also casts Tangled Florahedron, letting him make a food token in his end step, and draw a card for being the Monarch. Also, at the end of turn, I activate Scroll of Fate, manifesting a card from my hand. On my turn, I play an island and cast my commander Vannifar Evolved Enigma, and when I move to combat, she triggers, putting a +1/+1 counter on each colorless creature I control. I then attack Cow for 1 and Jason for 6, and on attacks, Ugin's Mastery triggers, so I turn one of my face-down creatures face up, flipping up Whisperwood Elemental, which manifests the top card of my library in my end step. Jason blocks with both of his vampires, gaining 2 life, while Cow takes 1 and I become the Monarch, drawing for it at the end of turn, and also manifesting the top card of my library. On Bilal's turn, he moves straight to combat, attacking me for 3 with the 7 dwarves, making a treasure token, but I block it with Vannifar, killing the dwarf and taking no damage. Then in Bilal's second main phase, he casts Dragon's Approach, doing 3 damage to each opponent. In Jason's upkeep, Court of Ambition triggers, with Bilal discarding a card, while Cow and I both lose 3 life. He then plays a Vault of the Archangel, and attacks Bilal for 2 with Teysa, then moves straight to his end step, making 3 clues and a vampire token. At the end of turn, Cow sacrifices a clue, drawing a card, and putting a +1/+1 counter on both the tracker and the squirrel. On Cow's turn, he plays a Temple of the False God, and casts Trading Post, before attacking me with Guillaume for 5, retaking the Monarchy, and drawing for it at the end of turn. Also at the end of turn, Jason sacrifices a clue to draw a card, make a spirit token with Teysa, which then also makes him a vampire token with Baron. Still at the end of turn, I also activate my Scroll of Fate to manifest another card from my hand. On my turn, I play an island, then I move to combat, triggering Vannifar and putting a +1/+1 counter on all my colorless creatures. Once that's resolved, I attack Cow for 1 with the Lurker, and Jason for 6 with 2 manifest creatures. On attacks, I trigger Ugin's Mastery, turning one of the morphs attacking Jason face up into Trail of Mystery, now letting me search my library for a basic land and put it into my hand whenever a face-down creature enters under my control, and also giving a creature +2/+2 whenever it turns face up. Before blocks, Jason sacrifices a clue, draws a card, makes a spirit token, and makes a vampire token. This lets him block the remaining manifest with 3 vampires, killing all 4 creatures and gaining him 3 life, while Cow still takes 1 and I reclaim the Monarchy. In my second main phase, I cast a Morph, triggering Ugin's Mastery, manifesting the top card of my library, and then, since 2 face-down creatures enter under my control, I search my library for 2 basic lands, putting them into my hand. In my end step, I draw a card for being the Monarch and manifest the top card of my library with Whisperwood, searching my library for yet another basic land and putting it into my hand. On Bilal's turn, he simply untaps and passes, but at the end of turn, Jason sacrifices another clue to draw a card, make a spirit, and make a vampire. Unfortunately, at this point in the game, I briefly lose connection to my Wi-Fi, so I miss a few things that happen on Jason's turn in the recording, but he winds up triggering Court of Ambition, with each of his opponents choosing to discard a card, play a Plains, casts a Ghostly Prison, making each opponent pay 2 mana to attack him, and then attacks each opponent for 1 with a spirit token, retaking the Monarchy. Finally, at the end of turn, Jason draws for being the Monarch, makes 3 clue tokens, and makes a vampire token. Also at the end of turn, Cow activates his trading post, sacrificing an artifact, which in this case is a clue, to draw a card and put a +1/+1 counter on the squirrel and the tracker. Still not done yet, Cow sacrifices another clue to draw a card and put another counter on his 2 creatures. On Cow's turn, he plays a swamp, making a clue token, then cast Reclamation Sage, destroying Jason's ghostly prison when it enters the battlefield. After that, he cast a Feasting Troll King, creating 3 food tokens when it enters the battlefield, and attacks Jason for 5 with Guillaume, taking the Monarchy. Then, at the end of turn, Cow makes 2 food tokens with Guillaume and draws for being the Monarch, while Jason sacrifices a clue to draw a card, make a Spirit token, and make a Vampire token. Finally, I also cycle Desert of the Indomitable and activate Scroll of Fate, manifesting a card from my hand and searching my library for a basic land, putting it into my hand. On my turn, I play a Temple of Mystery, scrying 1, and when I move to combat, Vannifar triggers, putting a +1/+1 counter on each of my colorless creatures. Then I attack Cow for 4 with the Lurker and a Manifest, attack Bilal for 5 with a Manifest, and attack Jason for 6 with 2 Manifests. This triggers Ugin's Mastery, letting me turn the Manifest creature attacking Cow face up, revealing Ugin the Ineffable, making my colorless spells cost 2 less to cast. Notably, since Ugin's Mastery turns it face up, and it doesn't leave the battlefield, this means Ugin should have entered with 0 loyalty counters and immediately died, but we don't catch that at the time. Once that's resolved, Jason blocks one of my Manifest with 3 vampires and the other with a single spirit, killing all 4 of his tokens and one of my Manifests, gaining him 3 life, while Bilal takes 5, Cow takes 1, and I reclaim the Monarchy. In my second main phase, I activate Ugin's +1 ability, exiling the top card of my library and creating a 2/2 colorless spirit token that, when it dies, returns the exiled card to my hand. At the end of turn, I manifest the top card of my library, search my library for a basic land, put it into my hand, and draw a card for being the Monarch. Also at the end of turn, Jason sacrifices a clue to make a spirit token and a vampire token, and Bilal activates his blast miner to destroy my scavenger grounds, making himself a treasure. In response, I activate the grounds, sacrificing itself to exile all cards from all graveyards. On Bilal's turn, he attacks me for 2 with blast miner, making a treasure, and I block and kill it with Vannifar, but this gives him the 5 treasures he needs to activate Magda, sacrificing them and searching his library for a Thrumming Stone, putting it into play, giving his spells Ripple 4. Then, in his second main phase, he casts Dragon's Approach, doing 3 damage to each opponent, and letting him reveal the top 4 cards of his library, casting any other copies of Dragon's Approach from among them for free, which will also have Ripple 4. Since this will most likely win him the game, I respond by turning Inox Survivalist face up, destroying Thrumming Stone. The initial ripple still resolves though, revealing 2 additional approaches, both of which he casts, doing 6 more damage to each of his opponents. In Jason's upkeep, his court triggers, making Bilal lose 3 life while Cow and I both discard a card. Then he cast Oher Tak, Deepest Foundation, tripling the amount of tokens he would create. He then attacks each opponent with a 1/1 spirit token, reclaiming the Monarchy, and in his second main phase, cast Idol of Oblivion, which can tap to let him draw a card, but only if he made a token that turn. Finally, in his end step, he draws a card for being the Monarch, makes 9 clue tokens, makes 3 vampire tokens, and taps the Idol of Oblivion to draw a card. Also at the end of turn, Cow activates Trading Post to sacrifice a food and draw a card, then sacrifices another clue to draw another card. On Cow's turn, he plays a swamp and casts Mirkwood Bats, making each opponent lose a life whenever he creates or sacrifices a token. He moves to combat, attacking Jason for 7 with Feasting Troll King, and attacks Ugin for 5 with Guillaume. Before the blocks, I use Scroll of Fate to manifest a card, searching my library for a basic land and putting it into my hand. Then I use the new manifest and Ugin's spirit token to block, only taking 1 damage from trample and putting the exiled card from Ugin into my hand, while Jason takes the full 7. In order to save his commander, Cal also sacrifices a food token, giving Guillaume indestructible until the end of turn, making each opponent lose a life and putting another counter on the squirrel. In his second main phase, Cal casts Tireless Provisioner, letting him either make a treasure or food when a land enters under his control. He then plays a swamp, which unfortunately he couldn't have done since he's already played a land that turn, makes a treasure, a clue, and makes each opponent lose 2 life. After that, he casts God Eternal Bantu, sacrificing any number of permanents when it enters the battlefield and drawing that many cards. This lets him sacrifice 5 of his artifact tokens, leaving him with just a treasure, making each of his opponents lose 5 life and drawing 5 cards. He also cast Cultivate, searching his library for 2 basic lands, putting one into play tapped and the other into his hand, triggering the Provisioner again, making another treasure, clue, and making each opponent lose 2 life. Finally, Cal moves to his end step and makes 3 more food tokens with Guillaume, making each opponent lose another 3 life, knocking me out of the game. On Bilal's turn, he cast a Dragon's Approach, doing 3 damage to each of his opponents. In Jason's upkeep, Court of Ambition triggers, with Cal discarding a card and Bilal losing 3 life. Then Jason sacrifices a clue, drawing a card, making 3 spirit tokens and 3 vampire tokens. He activates Idol of Oblivion, drawing a card, and casts his own Mirkwood Bats, now making his opponents lose a life whenever he creates or sacrifices a token. In response, Cal casts Rowan's Grim Search, sacrificing a clue to bargain it, looking at the top 4 cards of his library, putting 2 on top and the other 2 into his graveyard, drawing 2, losing 2 life, and making each opponent lose a life. Then the bats resolve, and Jason moves to combat, attacking Cal for 8 with his spirits and vampires. Cal blocks a spirit and all 4 vampires, taking 3 damage and killing all but 3 of Jason's spirits, while Jason gains 4. In his second main phase, Jason casts Treacherous Greed, sacrificing a spirit to draw 3 cards, gain 3 life, and make each opponent lose 4 life, knocking Bilal out of the game. At the end of turn, Jason creates 6 clue tokens, making Cal lose 6 life, but in response, Cal uses Trading Post to discard a card and gain 4 life, staying in the game. Then, on his turn, he's able to easily attack through Jason's blockers, doing more than enough damage to knock him out, and winning Cal the game. Alright, so that was a sweet game. Definitely a lot going on in that game, and I do want to apologize. I had some internet issues while we were recording the game, so there were a couple of turns where things might have jumped a little bit and I may have missed recording certain game actions that were taken. I did my best to make sure that I recapped everything when I came back in, but it definitely was kind of a byproduct of some of the moves that we've been doing lately, not having access to perfect internet. But I don't think it affected the game too much. We were still able to participate, still able to get a lot of things in. And overall, I think the deck felt incredibly powerful. I think that being able to constantly manifest cards, constantly morph cards, use Vannifar to put +1/+1 counters on our cards, the deck really felt like it couldn't lose in combat. And the fact that we were playing against 3 decks that don't intend to win through combat just kind of meant that we were put in a bad position, but I still think that we held our own and put up quite the fight as the game went on. Moving around the table to Bilal, he really got stuck on 3 lands the entire game, but despite that, he was able to stick enough dwarves that he could keep generating treasure as the game went on to put himself in a position to potentially win. And if we hadn't had the artifact removal for Thrumming Stone, then we definitely would have lost on his turn, because he did spin into 2 more Dragon's Approaches. Each of those would have also had Ripple 4, so he really could have just gone through his entire deck and just done like 40-50 damage to the entire table. So it was really cool to see him get that close to winning on only 3 lands, and that definitely feels like a thing that Bilal can pull off more so than anybody else. Continuing around the table for Jason, his deck really popped off this game, and I think that he did a great job of just showing what Teysa can really do. The fact that there were multiple turns where all he did was pass the turn and sacrifice clues meant that he, could make 3 clues on his turn, sacrifice 1 clue on each opponent's turn, letting him make a spirit, letting him make a vampire, and then just kind of repeat that process. It was very impressive to see what he could do without really casting that many spells. It was a very powerful deck, especially once he got Oher Talk on the battlefield. And we've seen this deck before. I imagine we will continue to see it. It is incredibly powerful, and I'm sure there's only ever going to be good upgrades coming for it. And then, of course, last but not least, we have our winner of the game, Cow. Guillaume is an incredibly powerful deck, and every time I see it, it really reminds me of just how powerful the food synergies are that have been printed very recently in Magic. I think that it's one of those decks that benefits pretty much from any set that gets printed now, because even though Cow leans heavily into food tokens, he does also care about things like clues and treasures, and those are also just continuously printed. So I think Guillaume just gets better and better with every single set, and it's very difficult to interact with on a level that actually makes a difference, because you don't really want to waste your removal spells on things like clues and food tokens, but there's not really any other good targets. Everything just kind of synergizes together. There's not one major threat. Everything combined is typically a threat. So, like I said, big fan of the deck. We've seen it a couple of times. I'm hoping to see it more in the future as it keeps getting better. So let me know down in the comments what you thought of the game and, of course, what you thought of the deck. Let me know if there's any cards you think should be added to our deck or maybe taken out of it. And, of course, as always, if you have suggestions for future videos, please do let me know about those in the comments as well. But with all of that being said, please do like the video, subscribe to the channel, and I will see you all on the other side of the Dungeon Learner's Guide.